Well, it appears that quite a few of you enjoy the series that I started on the classic vehicle market and vehicle valuations and what some good buys are that you can find. So we talked about the Ford Thunderbird, the Glamour Bird from 1967 to 1971 as a car that really never caught on with collectors, and you can still find them in the high teens, low 20s, I would say, in absolutely mint condition. And they're just great cars for the money, to be honest. But one of the things that I will say that's really starting to come alive now is the big iron, the unique big iron. And I'll elaborate more on that in a second. More specifically, cars like this 1976 Fleetwood. This wasn't even a Talisman model, but this car, it had 3,900 original miles, and it sold for $74,000 on Bring a Trailer in the last week. And this is on top of a 1979 Lincoln Continental Mark V that had under 100 miles on it that sold on Bring a Trailer for $140,000. $140,000. So the big iron that was really never loved by much of anybody is finally coming alive in a big way if you have the right car. If it's just kind of a daily driver, everyday vehicle, then no. But if it's a super low mileage, mint condition classic, well, again, it's starting to come alive. And I would also say the everyday car. There was also on Bring a Trailer, I featured this Chevrolet Cavalier wagon that was in beautiful condition that had less than 2,000 miles on it. It sold for $30,000. A Cavalier wagon. I don't understand that one. I don't know why somebody has such a fond memory, or two people evidently have such a fond memory of 80s era Cavalier wagons that they really had to have it. But, oh well, this is what's happening in the collector vehicle market. So let me give you a little bit of thoughts on some of these cars. Let's start with this 1976 Fleetwood and what I think made it so special. Well, first of all, it's obviously the mileage. One of the things that is really prized amongst collectors now is low mileage original cars. And for those people who think that that was always a prized element of a collectible car, it actually was not. When I first started collecting cars 20 years ago, the real prize was a car that had been restored. Even if it were low mileage and original, collectors really wanted it to be absolutely perfect rather than an imperfect original. That was the philosophy, and I think it was kind of because of all these judging awards, particularly like the Corvette Club. They would award points on a 100-point scale to just how great a restoration was. Did you have all the chalk marks in the right place? Did you have the overspray on the big block exhaust manifolds, as an example? Had it all been done correctly? And it was kind of a competition to try to get a 100-point or near 100-point car. And you just couldn't get that with an original car that by that point was, let's say, in some cases, 40 plus years old. So you had to have a restored car in order to get something that was that high of a point winner. And I think that was, like I said, that was the philosophy back then. But then the philosophy over the last, I would say, 20 years has really pivoted ever since the advent of Bring a Trailer to low mileage classics. And people will now say it's only original once. Now that generally pertains to cars that are in great shape. If a car has low mileage, but it was stored in a barn and it's got mouse poop all over and the mice have chewed the interior and the paint looks terrible, well, you're probably better off just to go ahead and restore it. In any case, this Fleetwood, I think what really drew collectors to it was that this is the last year of this big, big Fleetwood, the 133-inch wheelbase, largest GM non-limousine production car ever produced. The only car that really topped this in terms of overall length was the 73 Imperial. And obviously that was a Mopar product. But GM didn't have anything that was this big, this long. And I think that made it special. This car was not, as I mentioned, a Talisman version. The Talisman, if you got that, had these super puffy seats with the crushed velour. Those are becoming very, very prized collectibles. I could have bought one probably 10, 15 years ago in mint condition for $25,000, and I offered that, and the guy wanted a little bit more, but he still didn't take the $25,000. I don't even know what that would bring if it were a 3,900-mile Fleetwood Talisman. My guess is it would be pushing $100,000, maybe even a little higher. But I think that what really drew collectors to this is the low mileage, the last year of the Fleetwood, and the fact that it's big. Collectors love these big, brash, big iron cars. So they want cars with, let's say, that are super large or that have special interiors in addition to low mileage. The fact that it's low mileage alone is not necessarily going to get big dollars, but it's got to be something that is a period correct statement. Now, this Fleetwood, at least from my perspective, it was sold by Competition Cars in Myrtle Beach. Bill seems to sell really nice cars. He doesn't sell rusty cars. This car was in really nice shape. I will say, from my perspective, it had a couple disqualifying elements associated with it. One is that it had been repainted. And you take a look at this paint on the hood and on the fender here. It looks perfect. And, that's great, but it's not original. If I'm going to buy a 3,900-mile car, I want original paint. In fairness to the previous owner, whomever painted it, the paint on these cars really stunk from the factory. Lacquer actually could have a great sheen to it. It did tend to dull and fade over time. You could buff it out. My guess is that somebody got a little aggressive with the hand buffer. These cars have lots of curves and edges, and the paint probably got thin, and that was it. But that's another lesson to you. Don't try to buff these things out on your own. Although I have buffed one out totally by hand without a rotary buffer back before I could afford a rotary buffer. I can't even tell you how many hours it took. It was a 72 Sedan DeVille, and it looked way better when I was done. But that was one good thing, is if you're buffing it by hand and you're just applying gentle pressure, you're not going to eat through the paint, even on the curves and the edges. So my car looked better after I was done. But I think that's what happened here. The other thing that happens is the bumper fillers, the original ones, crack. Then you got to get fiberglass ones outfitted, and then you really can never get the paint to match. So this one has clearly been repainted. It's missing some badging on the rear too. I think it's missing a Fleetwood badge on the deck lid. But that would have been a disqualifying feature for me. Now, I'm not disputing that this is a 3,900-mile original car, and I'm not disputing that the repaint probably looks better than the car did even new. And if you look at the interior is in fantastic shape. It's clearly a low-mileage car. The odometer has not been around. These front seats and the leather looks supple and new. Even if it's the driver's seat, the carpets look perfect. The dash looks perfect. So this car was really nice, and even under hood, the 500 cubic inch V8, the last year of the 500 for 1976, by which point it was making a paltry 190 horsepower in carbureted form, which is what this one is. The engine bay looks great. I can't quite discern. I can't tell if it's the lighting or if it's something else, but the Cadillac blue paint also looks a little bit off to me. The Cadillac blue paint was a little bit darker, I think. But again, that could just be the lighting. Generally, Cadillac had this beautiful navy blue paint, and this looks just a shade too light. So I'm thinking that somebody also detailed the engine compartment. But again, it's still clear, even if it's been detailed, these engine compartments look pretty rough after a year, or even parking the car in a non-climate controlled garage where you get some temperature and thermal cycling. That's just how it is. They weren't made to hold up because they weren't the showpieces that they came to be. So the Fleetwood, I think, sold for such a big amount because it was a great color, it was low mileage. Somebody probably liked the repaint. Again, for me, that would have been a disqualifier, especially since they forgot some of the badging on the deck lid. The interior, I think, while it was not a talisman, the interior on the 76 Fleetwood is an over-the-top interior. So I think somebody was okay with it not being a talisman because they still got something that was just crazy. And this is the last year of the Fleetwood that I mentioned, and the last year of this super large car. So that's why I think this one sold really well. Now let's rotate to the 1979 Lincoln Continental Mark V. Now this one is in 1979. Again, it's the final year of the Mark V before Lincoln would bring out the Mark VI. And I think the Mark V is a very stately vehicle. It looks great in this navy blue. The Collector Series gave you this gold trim. It gave you this buttons and biscuits interior. It's a fully loaded car, and it looks fantastic. And I think what really drew a collector to this one is clearly the super low mileage, 97 miles. it's probably going to be the best or nearly the best one that's out there. The fact that it was the last year Mark V, the 1979 variant, and that it looks like it's in beautiful condition. The color is great on these collector series, that blue with the gold. The interior is an outrageous over-the-top interior, but by the way, they used a similar interior on the Diamond Jubilee editions in the previous years. And, from my perspective, I'm really surprised by how much the 1979 collector series goes for. And what it tells me is people who are collecting these maybe aren't necessarily the biggest historical car aficionados. And what do I mean? Why would I want to collect a 1979 collector series with a 400 cubic inch engine under hood? By the time 1979 rolled around, you could no longer get the 460 in your Mark V. I would much rather have a beautiful mint condition Diamond Jubilee 1978 model with a 460 under hood than a 79 with a 400. And I think what's happening is people just don't care anymore about the specifics, or they don't know about the elements that maybe the people who grew up with these cars would know. The 400 really wasn't that great of a V8 from Ford. It did have a decent amount of torque. In a number of years, they had issues with the lower ends. They would lose oil pressure. They had casting porosity issues on some of them in model years in the mid to late 70s. I think it was corrected by this point. But regardless, it just wasn't all that great of an engine. And the 460 really didn't have any issues, so to speak, aside from they had a phenolic or plastic timing gear that you should replace. But that was no big deal. You change the water pump, change that timing gear, and then you're good to go, and your 460 will last just about forever. But again, I think somebody was attracted to this because it was a last year. It was a beautiful color, which came with the collector series. It had a cool interior. And it's kind of makes sense. But again, not a car for me that I would put at the top of my list. In fact, it's really hard for me to say that I would pick any of these mid to late 70s cars as super collectibles, just because I think that the mid to late 60s cars, early 1970s cars, drive much, much better than these mid 70s or late 70s cars. I mean, you're talking about, as I mentioned, in that Fleetwood, 190 horsepower engine, pushing 5,000 pounds. And in this case, with the 400 cubic inch V8, you're talking about 159 horsepower. Now, there are some who claim that there were some 460 1979 models. I'm not quite sure if that's true or not. I haven't seen one. Could be true. But those would have made about 208 horsepower. So big difference. And like I said, that is just not something that, it's not as enjoyable of a drive. And I would say the Mark Vs also don't drive as well as the Mark IVs, and the Mark IVs don't drive as well as the Mark IIIs. So if you really wanted to pick a car that, by my estimation, would be a much better vehicle, get a Mark III versus a Mark V, and you will not regret it. You have much more power. You have a premium fuel 460 cubic inch V8 as opposed to one that has been bogged down significantly by emissions. And by this point, you've got an emissions-laden 400 cubic inch engine under hood. But hey, somebody really wanted it, and the car looks great. So they bought it. And I guess a couple people must have been bidding back and forth, and more than a couple people who wanted it. Lastly, I have to say the one that's really the head scratcher to me is the Cavalier wagon that I pointed out before. Now, this was a 1,400-mile copy in admittedly mint condition. You could eat off the underside of this car. And I think that's probably what endeared it to whomever bought it. Somebody must have had a distinct sense of nostalgia, or a couple people did, and really wanted this car. And this is unquestionably, I think, the best one that I've ever seen in 20 years plus, maybe. And I think that whomever procured this just thought that they weren't going to be able to find another one in this kind of shape. I think that's absolutely right. Now, what's interesting about it is it's an 85 model. It's obviously a wagon. It has the 2-liter 4-cylinder, the cast iron 4-cylinder, which is a pretty good engine by this point. But it's not a V6 model. It's not a performance model, except for the fact that this wagon did have the F41 suspension package, the ride and handling package. But I think why somebody really wanted this was just the condition. The mileage was super low, but the underbody was ridiculously clean for something of this era GM car. And the paint was great, which is really saying something because 80s era GM paint was terrible. It just used to peel off and check and look absolutely awful. This car was obviously always garage, but heck, even the GM cars that were garaged used to do that. So this one really was a rarity, and I guess somebody just had to have it. So what should you look for in terms of the, let's say, new vehicles that are gaining momentum in the collector car marketplace? It's amazing to me because I almost bought this 1985 Chevrolet Corvette with only 8,000 miles. I could have bought it for $14,000, and it was in mint condition. It needed a heater core, but the paint was perfect. The interior was in great shape. It ran great, drove great. I just hesitated to pull the trigger because I can only have so many 80s era GM cars. And on C4s, if you haven't driven one, you really do sit in a pit, more so than other Corvettes. It's really tough ingress, egress, and myself and my wife are both rather tall. It's not all that comfortable. The pedal box is pretty narrow, especially even compared with my 82 Trans Am. That car I have no trouble fitting in. And interestingly, the Fiero I used to have, my 88 Fiero GT, very comfortable even for a tall person. But the Vet, it just was not necessarily as comfortable as I had hoped. Regardless, I could have picked that up for a song and it was in great shape. But I think what's happening now is people, as I mentioned, really want very low mileage cars and ones that are kind of wacky. And these everyday cars like that Fleetwood and the Collector Series, even though it was called the Collector Series Mark V, few people really saved it. They bought it and then they drove it. Same with the Fleetwood and obviously the Cavalier. Those were used and abused, especially the wagons, and just thrown away. So the relative survival rate of these cars is extremely low. Everybody kept their Corvettes and Camaros and Mustangs and performance cars, relatively speaking. You're also seeing some of this with the collector car market in that Chrysler vehicles in particular tend to be the most expensive because they wore out the fastest. They rusted quickly. They weren't as well built. So consequently, there aren't that many around, and they're increasingly and exceedingly rare. So rarity is a huge part of the collector car marketplace, and also I'll call it the funky factor. That Cadillac Fleetwood, just being that last year 76 with that interior, funky. That Collector Series Mark V with the low mileage and that interior, funky. This Cavalier, funky. So just because something's got low mileage, I've seen plenty of mid-70s Ford LTDs with even 1,000 miles on them, and the seller is struggling to get $15,000 for it. It's a mint condition car. It's just because there are quite a few of those LTDs still around, and they're not all that special. They're just kind of blah. But for somebody who wants, let's say, something really interesting or that evokes a childhood memory, they'll tend to pay a lot. And those are my thoughts. So what do you think? What's next on the collector car market? If you ask me, what do I think will continue to go up in value? I think it's about time the big iron is really starting to take off. It was unloved for so long, but now people are realizing that it's pretty much extinct, and they really were great cars in general. Maybe not that 76 Fleetwood because the build quality of the Cadillacs then was pretty awful, but a lot of the big iron is really what made American cars so great. They drove well, they rode well, they slurped the gas, sure they did, but who cares? And they looked great. So that's what I think is going to continue to grow in value, are these pieces of big iron, especially with unique interiors and low miles. Put a comment in the comment section with what your thoughts are. Thanks again for watching.